Hello there, everybody. Welcome to the next A-level GeogPod. This time focusing down on diverse places unit inquiry question 3. So as usual, the usual reminder here, this is not a replacement for your in-class learning. This is for purely revision purposes, and make sure that you do always refer back to your in-class notes, your textbook work and your independent learning. So let's begin looking at the overview of inquiry question 3. So what have we covered so far in these GeogPod sessions? We've covered inquiry question 1, which the overall question was, how do population structures vary? And we've covered inquiry question 2, how do different people view diverse living spaces? So the main overriding question here for EQ3 is, why are there demographic and cultural tensions in diverse places? If you do want to pause the screen now and have a quick look at the specification page on the right hand side of this screen, please feel free to do so. Okay, so this is where we start our whistle stop tour of EQ3, going back to some of the lesson material that you would have covered in this unit. So the first part of EQ3 was looking at internal migration in the UK. So migration within the United Kingdom itself, not from outside, but within. 3 key areas here that you'd have explored and discussed is describe the patterns of internal migration. So where are people coming from? Where are less people coming from? And why is there these differences? Explain the impacts of this migration. That's both positive and negative. And then comparing the different regional impacts. So you started by looking at this map on the right hand side here. Which clearly shows flow line and proportional arrows. Now remember, this is a particular skill and technique that you do need to get to grips with. It's data presentation on a map. So the lines themselves, the arrows themselves, where they're leading out from is London, and they're leading to different parts of the United Kingdom. In this case, it's England and Wales only. And the thickness of the arrow gives a visual indication as to the number of migrants, the number of internal migrants moving out of London to certain regions of England and Wales. So what you'd have done as a class is analyze this map, explain some of the areas where people are moving to in larger numbers, and why that is the case, and then explaining why there are certain areas of England and Wales where people are moving to, but in lower numbers. So you can see on the right hand side, it explains here internal migration is a residential move between regions. It excludes moves within the same local authority. So for example, in central Bedfordshire, if somebody moved from one area of central Beds to another area in central Beds, that would not be included in the internal migration figures. So you'd have then looked at a similar map here, which is another flow line map showing the net flow of people to London. So looking at where people are travelling from within England and Wales, where they're coming from to London. And what this shows you is 2 levels of data here. The red lines show you the migration flow out of London again, but the green lines show the migration flow into London. And again, the thickness of the line gives an indication as to the data, the number. So for the red line, the thicker the line, the more people are moving to that particular place from London. With the green line, the thicker the line, the more people moving to that place from London. So go back to your class notes here, look at the explanations you'd have gone through from the lesson and all the reasons that lie behind the patterns and the data that is explained on this map. Overall, what you'd have come up with here is there is a southern shift. Some of the reasons that you'd have explored now, again on the screen here, this is just the basics here. You'd have gone into much more depth in your own notes. Some of the reasons for the change in migration, counter urbanization, which really is applied to those red lines there, people moving out of the urban city of London. Second, the north-south divide, and then looking at push and pull factors of migration internally within England and Wales. So we'd have then referred back to one of the leading reasons for change in the United Kingdom. One of them is counter urbanisation. So remind yourselves of what this process is. It's when people move from urban areas into the surrounding rural. It's part of the urbanisation cycle. So urbanisation is the growth of the city. Suburbanisation is when people move from the inner city to the suburbs and the city grows outwards, urban sprawl. And then you get the process of counter urbanisation. And it's very important for you to be aware this isn't just a demographic change in terms of population and people. It's a social process as well, but also businesses and economic sides are applied to counter urbanisation. It's not just the movement of people. So what you'd have then done is you've discussed and fully explained some of the main pull factors attracting city dwellers to rural areas, and there's a summary there. And then you'd have looked at the main push factors, forcing people to leave urban areas. Now, remember, push and pull factors are a major part of the explanation and the theory that lie behind all of this. And in the diverse places unit, in EQ1, you'd have referred to Lee's migration model. So you then revisited this north-south divide. Oh, apologies again. And this point here says there was also a clear pattern showing the many northern internal migrants moving to the southeast and London. So you'd have focused on that in particular and given detailed explanations as to why that is. And that's when you'd have started to break down this north-south divide in a lot more detail. So the north-south divide is an idea that says the north has less government spending per head, lower wages, lower quality of life, etc., could be linked to this growing shift towards the south. You were then given a homework task. So do look back at this, some additional reading here. Visit the following 3 reading pieces and make notes for your homework on the patterns of migration internally in the United Kingdom. And that will aid your understanding of what you did in that particular lesson. So if you want to go back to look at those links, please do. EQ3 then moves on to look at international migration. So this is migration beyond borders. So movement of people into the United Kingdom from other countries and people moving from the United Kingdom to other countries. So 3 particular parts to this. What are the patterns of international migration to the UK? So a similar process is what you did with the internal. What are the reasons for this? And how does this impact the UK? Again, both positive and negative. And you'd have started by looking at this. This is a much more simplified version of the world map in terms of history here. And you'd have been asked, what does this map actually show? Now, in terms of the red areas, really, you'd have discussed this as a class, and what you'd have unpicked is hopefully that all of these places on the planet here are former British colonies. So you'd have had a discussion about colonialisation, what it is, what happened, how it developed, and so on. And this figure here is important. This was the largest ever empire. The British Empire was the largest ever empire and covered 24% of the world land, as well as over 400 million people were once part of the British Empire. And what you'd have discussed again is it's been a significant part in the UK's migration story. And to some extent, it still is. So you'd have then looked at why do people move to the United Kingdom? And using that previous map, you'd have discussed and explained this as a class. You'd have looked at what we call the post-colonial migration. And many of you wouldn't have known that it was actually government policy that promoted immigration from former British colonies. So once former British colonies have gained independence, um, like Pakistan and India and countries in the West Indies in the 1940s, then up to the 1960s, it was government policy to actually allow people who lived in those former British colonies to move to the UK to live and work. And then you'd have discussed the impacts of globalization. So going back to that first unit, again, here's the synopticity coming in. The UK was attractive in the 1990s. There was many UK global brands. The UK global culture from around the world was being presented here as something that people want to be part of. And this led to a surge in international migration, mainly to fill job gaps. There were many TNCs that were encouraging immigration, people to come to the United Kingdom from skilled nations. After 1992, there was the freedom of movement across the EU that took place. Um, the UK signed up to this and then allowed people to move to the UK from within the European Union, freedom of movement. And then there were many younger migrants who were targeted by the UK government again to try and tackle the ageing population problem that was starting to develop in the United Kingdom. So put all this together, there are many different reasons here to underlie why people from other countries started to move to the UK in larger numbers. What you'd have then done as a class is you would have given these range of statements, and you needed to sort those statements into both positive and negative. And then, to add another layer of complication here, each of those, once you've decided one goes into a positive category, is it positive for an urban area or is it positive for a rural area? And what you'd have then done was discussed each of these to add further depth and detail. So here is the summary that you'd have looked at. So down the left-hand side, you've got your categories. So across the top, your first layer there are your urban positives. These are positives, positive effects, impacts, consequences as a result of international migrants coming to the UK. Then you've got the negatives in urban areas. Then you've got the positives for the rural and the negatives for the rural. Again, on this screen, this is a summary. You would have gone into a lot more depth in the lesson. So please look back at your class notes. What you'd have then done is very briefly, this shows you, had a look at this, the 2018 top 10 score source nations for UK immigrant populations. And again, you'd have discussed this. And this leads you on to another proportional flow line map, which this time you'd have drawn yourselves. Previously, in the other lesson, you've looked at proportional line maps. You looked at how they work and what they show. You'd have then used this set of data to draw your own. So as it says there, see the adjacent data for the top 10 migrant populations in the UK. Are there any countries on there you're surprised by? Are there any on there you thought would have been there that are not? And you'd have discussed this. So your task was to construct that proportional flow line map. So go back and have a look at it. Some points here. Remember, a proportional line map uses arrows from the source country to the UK, because remember, this is international migrants moving to the United Kingdom. And then on the next slide, you'll have a look at some examples. And you'd have discussed different ways of producing flow line maps, proportional flow line maps, to present that data that you were given. Right, EQ3 then moves on to look at community evolution. Now that leads on quite nicely, because if we've just been talking about international migrants coming to the United Kingdom, that is changing and evolving our communities in the UK. So here there are two jobs. How have people's experiences and perceptions of their changing community changed over time? So was this international migration perceived more negatively in the past or more positively? And how has that changed up to the present day? And then how have economics and culture changed over time as a result of this migration flow? So you'd have looked at an example of people and communities experiencing change here. And a bit of picture analysis you'd have analysed in the lessons here. So two pictures above are the before. This is the London Docklands. And you can see what the London Docklands was like in the top left and the top right. And then after its decline and during its and after its regeneration, what it has then become. And we will be taking you, or once you watch this, we would either taken you or we will be taking you to the London Docklands to conduct field work in this area. And you'd have discussed in the lesson what was the communities like before regeneration? What was the communities like after regeneration? And that's why we take you down to London Docklands so you can experience this for yourself. And you can make that judgment and collect data on the communities in these areas. So you'd have done an awful lot of work during this unit on the LDDC, the London Docklands Development Corporation, what it was, why it was set up, what did it do, what were its aims, was it success, and so on. You'd have looked at particular areas of the London Docklands. What areas were regenerated, at what time, and how. So again, revisit your notes on this. You were then asked to produce a detailed report, a detailed case study, looking at these different areas of the London Docklands regeneration, and with a particular focus here on how the community was changing over time. So you can see the section 1 asks you to look at how has the London Docklands changed over time? What was its growth? When did it grow? When and why and how did it decline? And then looking at the recent generation. Section 2, what do people think about its regeneration? So this is people's perceptions. Who perceived the regeneration as positive and why? Who perceived it as negative and why? Section 3, what impacts have there been on culture in this area? So that's culture in different places of the Docklands. Who was leaving? Who was coming in? How did areas change? How did the cultural makeup areas change? Positively, negatively? And then section 4, why and how have these changes affected the economy of the London Docklands, both positively and negatively? And then 5, has the project been a success? Bringing all of that together and looking at both the positives and negatives for different groups of people and making a judgment based on the evidence that you've gathered. So you'd have been given lots of links to use. You've got your textbook there, page 282 to 283 was very useful. You had some websites to access. You had some articles that you were given. And then you'd have applied this to a question. How is this case study an example of cultural and economic evolution? So go back to your notes, your structure, your answer to that question to remind yourselves of the detail that you put into this. And then your homework, you were asked to go away and watch a TED Talk. And you'd have used that in the next lesson. So please revisit your notes on the TED Talk that were very appropriate for the London Docklands regeneration. Now I've just thrown this in here. This will now appear in all future lessons. There is a university online lecture here that I would like you to go and have a look at. This is focused on urban renewal, called Iterative Cities, Renewal and Revitalisation from the Bottom Up, by a guy called Marcus Westbury. Again, this is a Sheffield University lecture. So please look at this adds some further depth and detail about urban renewal and how it is conducted and the positives and negatives. Okay, EQ3 then moves on, quite conveniently, onto ethnic segregation and ghettos. Again, this is part of the community, the ethnic, the cultural evolution of a place. Three particular parts to this: what international migrants tend to live in London and where. How is ethnic segregation caused? So first of all, is it happening? What is the evidence of it? And then why is it happening if the data's showing it's happening? And then three, what are the indicators of segregation? What's the evidence, the visual, the data, the quantitative, the qualitative data that we can use to decide if this is happening? So first of all, you would needed to have defined what these two terminologies are. So what is ethnic segregation? So pause this and remind yourselves. And this shows you an example of apartheid in South Africa. And then what is a ghetto? The term ghettoization can also be used here. So what is a ghetto? Where did it originate, this key term? And then an example as well. And you'd have then looked at these three ex-colonies. So these are three largest ex-colonies in terms of migration to the UK. So people coming from South Africa, Jamaica, and India. And then you'd have looked at a particular group of people, and we class this under the category of income migration. You'd have looked at the Russian oligarchs. So the term oligarch is a member of a small group of wealthy, powerful people who control an area or organization. And here you started to explore the Russian oligarchs in London. And you'd have put together a mini case study example here, looking at ethnic segregation, in particular the Russian oligarchs in London. Where are they? Why are they moving there? How is it created what we call segregated enclaves in particular areas of London like Kensington, Mayfair, Westminster? And then what's the reasons for the Russian oligarchs coming to live, work, buy property in London? So maybe pause this again, have a look at this information and revisit it in your class notes. What you'd have then looked at is some measures. How do you measure what we call social exclusion or segregation in cities? Now it says here, whilst many Russians choose to live in a cluster in London, not all ethnic groups are the same. Some groups are forced to live, forced segregation, if you like, in certain areas, and there's many reasons for that. Some of them are economic reasons, some of them are social reasons. So look at this BBC News article, again, if you didn't do so at the time, or look back at your notes. And then you'd have brought this social exclusion together, and you'd have looked at this Bristol social exclusion matrix. Now, it summarizes on the left-hand side. So the BSEM, the Bristol social exclusion matrix, splits migrants' needs into three categories. You can see that on the diagram: quality of life, participation, and resources. And then you've got break-off categories from each of those. Like, for example, quality of life. You've got people removed for health and well-being, the living environment, crime, harm, and criminalisation. So each of these is then used as a measure to see how socially excluded groups actually are. The third bullet point, it says the fewer of the 10 measures a group has, the more socially excluded they are. Now, revisit your notes on this from the lesson, because that would have been explained in detail. And you'd have looked at some particular examples. Now, remember when I did this with my classes, we looked at our own situations in our own community, and we graded ourselves on each of these categories. And in Central Bedfordshire, rural Central Bedfordshire, we worked out that we weren't really that socially excluded from our communities. We then tried to apply that to people in certain parts of London to look at the differences. We then moved on to look at this idea of cultural fractionization. Now, again, revisit this in your notes. And what it is, it's a measure. It measures how diverse countries are by looking at people's views towards different factors such as religion, democracy, and law. And like the Human Development Index, it provides a score between 0 and 1. So what you can see is how culturally fractionalized are different nations of the world. Now, again, I've thrown this in here, very closely linked to the lesson content and the notes you'd made at the time. Another university lecture here. This time focused on ethnic and racial harassment in different areas. So please go and have a look at this. Please go and click on this link on the actual PowerPoint slide on the Google Classroom and on the Google Drive, so you can watch and listen to this lecture and make some notes. Then EQ3 starts to look at social exclusion and the built environment. So particularly paying attention to cities and how the built environment can start to take on characteristics of the people that are living there. So 3 things. How can change in the built environment affect the levels of social exclusion that exists? 2, what is the link between social exclusion and the built environment? So if you change the social makeup of an area, does the built environment change as a result? And then vice versa. If you start regenerating, for example, changing the built environment, does that then change the social makeup of an area? And then 3, what are some examples of the impacts of social exclusion? So you'd have looked at this very nice diagram here to show the internal and external factors of ethnic segregation in cities. So on the left-hand side, you've got the internal factors which are encouraging ethnic minorities to opt for segregation. And then on the right-hand side, the external factors. So action taken by the majority population to encourage ethnic segregation. So remind yourselves of these very important points here. And then we'd have brought this all into something called assimilation. In order to make ethnic minorities a more integrated part of society, they need to be assimilated. So assimilation is the process of understanding and becoming part of something, usually a community. And there's more to it than that. And that's what we would have looked at a later date in more depth. So that's for a future lesson. Then you'd have had a job to do from the textbook, page 322 and 323 of the Hodder book. You'd have looked at some maps and you'd describe the link between ethnic diversity and deprivation in Glasgow. You'd have explained the different causes of social tensions in Glasgow, and then you'd have analysed the impact that migration into Glasgow since 2001 has had on the city. So here you are putting together a very nice case study example, and there are some of the diagrams, data, maps that you'd have had a look at to put together that case study. So if you want to pause this here and remind yourself, please do. And there's some of the text that went with it. Now, this could have been brought up a lot earlier, actually. This underlies probably the last 3 or 4 parts of inquiry question 3. It's a process, it's an effect, it's a cause, all rolled into one. Gentrification is the process of improving an area to make it more middle class. So it originates from the word gentry, where the richer parts of the community and nation move into an area to change it, which links into point 2. The wealthier people often move into an area and change the socio-economic status. So this is closely linked to regeneration. Many areas, particularly London Docklands, with the case study you looked at, regenerated. Gentrification took place. And unfortunately, this does have some positives and some downsides, though. Forced segregation. It prices people out of areas. And again, you'd have looked at that in some depth in the lesson, and then you'd have looked at an example of the effects of gentrification in Brixton in London. Moved on, in gentrification, like this is like the London Docklands case study again, but part two. So you'd have been adding to it, where you'd have looked at the regeneration, the increase in housing supply, but a particular type of housing that was being built, luxury housing, rather than your social housing, and that impacted on affordability. It's led to gentrification, and they called it the march of the middle class into East London. They could afford these trendy new apartments, but the poorer communities couldn't. So they were forced out. And it drove groups of people who originally lived there out of an area, causing conflict, tension, resentment, and so on. And then you'd have looked at some of the viewpoints of people. These were some quotes from people in the London Docklands. And you can see there's a mix of perceptions here. So remind yourself about perceptions that different people, different groups, different stakeholders will have different views on a particular regeneration scheme. And then you'd have brought another case study into this case study example. You'd have looked at Southall. And Southall is an area of West London that has had conflicts for many different reasons. So what you'd have put the case study together here looking at is what was Southall like in the 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s? And how does Southall compare now? What were some of the issues, conflicts, tensions in Southall? And then what was being done to redevelop Southall? And how has it changed? So number three, what cultural conflicts still exist in Southall today and why? And then overall bringing this together and evaluating, do you think Southall has been, was, or is successfully redeveloped and managed? So again, revisit your notes on this. Here were some of the resources you were given. You were given some website links, some journal articles to look at, and then part of the textbook as well. Now here, I'm not going to spend this. This would take me half an hour to go through because I'd have to explain each of the points here, which absolutely fine. But this is just for revision purposes. Pause the screen because this is a nice summary of what has gone on in Southall with regards to those four categories of question. And again, I've put in here an online university lecture for you to access. This is looking at perception of place and in particular, looking at the geography of poverty here. So again, go back to the Google Drive to access this PowerPoint, click on that link, watch and listen to the lecture, make some notes to put them alongside this part of inquiry question 3 of diverse places. So that concludes inquiry question 3. So as I always say at the end of these, this is for revision purposes. Please make sure you look at this maybe 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4 times if you wish to fully get to grips with what inquiry question 3 is asking you to do. So that can really assist you, leading you into your internal progression exams or your final examinations. Thank you very much, folks.